mechanism that could not fail. Xian, 1974. Archaeologist Chen Meiling had spent 11 years studying Warring States and early imperial Chinese bronze work before the farmers digging a well outside Xian struck, quite by accident, the buried edge of what would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the entire 20th century. An enormous underground army of life-size terracotta soldiers, buried for over 2,000 years to guard the tomb of China's first unified emperor, Qin Shi Huang. The scale of the discovery, as excavation gradually revealed over the following years, was staggering enough on its own terms. Thousands of individually sculpted terracotta warriors, each face and posture subtly distinct, arranged in precise military formation exactly as a real Qin dynasty army would have been arrayed for battle. But it was not, in the end, the terracotta figures themselves that would occupy the greater part of Chen Meiling's own scholarly career, but rather a considerably smaller and less visually spectacular category of artifact recovered alongside them. The actual bronze weapons the terracotta soldiers had originally been equipped with, many of them remarkably well preserved despite their extraordinary age, and among these weapons, a particular category of small bronze mechanism that would eventually reveal something about ancient Chinese manufacturing that no historian studying the period had previously fully appreciated. "Bring this one to me directly," Chen told her excavation team on the afternoon in 1975 when workers clearing one of the pit's collapsed timber roof sections uncovered a small, intricately constructed bronze mechanism, remarkably intact despite having lain buried for well over 2 millennia, that she immediately recognized as the trigger assembly of an ancient crossbow. "And bring me every other trigger mechanism this pit has already yielded. I want to examine them together, side by side, before we catalog them individually." What the mechanisms revealed. It was in the painstaking comparative examination that followed, conducted over several months as additional trigger mechanisms continued emerging from the ongoing excavation, that Chen began to notice a pattern that struck her, as a specialist in ancient bronze metallurgy, as considerably more significant than the mere fact of the weapon's impressive age and remarkable state of preservation. "Measure this component again," she instructed her graduate assistant, a careful and meticulous young researcher named Zhou Fang, comparing two trigger mechanisms recovered from entirely different sections of the excavation site, separated by a considerable distance within the buried pit complex, and compare it against the equivalent component from the mechanism recovered 3 weeks ago from the eastern section. "I want precise measurements of every individual part, the locking mechanism, the release lever, the housing dimensions, all of it." The results, once Zhou Fang had completed his careful comparative measurements across a growing sample of recovered mechanisms, confirmed what Chen had begun to suspect from her own initial visual examination. The individual bronze components of these ancient crossbow triggers, manufactured based on surrounding archaeological context and inscriptions found on other recovered weapons, under the authority of the Qin state armory system in the final decades of the 3rd century BC, were standardized to a degree of precision and consistency that Chen had genuinely not expected to find in any manufacturing tradition of that particular historical period. "I want you to understand what we are actually looking at here," Chen told the small team of researchers gathered for what would become one of the more consequential internal discussions of the entire excavation project, some months into their comparative analysis. These trigger mechanisms were not manufactured individually, by an individual craftsman working alone on a single weapon from beginning to end, in the manner that most ancient weapons production, across most ancient civilizations, was traditionally understood to have proceeded. The individual components we are examining, the release lever, the locking pin, the housing casing, show a level of dimensional consistency across mechanisms recovered from entirely different locations within this vast burial complex that strongly suggests these components were manufactured according to standardized specifications. In sufficient quantity and with sufficient precision that components from one mechanism could very plausibly be interchanged with the equivalent component from an entirely different mechanism, manufactured potentially by an entirely different workshop or craftsman, and the resulting weapon would still function correctly. What this meant for an army. The implications of this finding, as Chen and her colleagues came to more fully appreciate Cove, are the following years of continued research, extended considerably beyond the narrow technical question of ancient Chinese bronzeworking precision, touching instead on a fundamental and previously underappreciated dimension of how the Qin state had actually managed to conquer and unify the whole of China in the first place, following the final, decisive decades of the long warring states period. Consider the practical military logistics this standardization actually enabled, Chen explained, in a paper she eventually published summarizing the excavation's findings regarding the weapon's production evidence specifically. A crossbow, unlike a simple spear or sword, is a genuinely complex mechanical device, dependent on the reliable function of a trigger mechanism containing multiple interacting bronze components working in precise coordination. If each individual weapon in a Qin army's arsenal had been manufactured as a unique, individually fitted mechanism, the traditional approach in most contemporary weapons manufacturing across the ancient world, where a craftsman built and fitted each component specifically to the particular weapon he was constructing, with components from one weapon generally unable to be reliably substituted into another. Then any damage to an individual crossbow's trigger mechanism during a campaign would have rendered that specific weapon effectively useless, until it could be returned to a skilled craftsman capable of repairing or replacing its uniquely fitted components, a process that would necessarily have been slow, resource-intensive, and entirely impractical to perform at any meaningful scale during an actual ongoing military campaign, particularly one being conducted as the Qin unification wars were. Across vast distances and sustained over multiple years of continuous campaigning. What the standardization evident in these recovered mechanisms suggests instead is a production system capable of manufacturing crossbow trigger components to sufficiently consistent specifications that damaged components could simply be replaced in the field with equivalent components drawn from a general supply of standardized parts, without requiring the specific individualized fitting and adjustment that non-standardized manufacturing would have demanded. This is not a minor technical curiosity. It represents, if our analysis is correct, a genuinely early and genuinely sophisticated application of a manufacturing principle, interchangeable parts, produced to standardized specifications precise enough to permit component substitution across supposedly individual devices, that most historians of technology have traditionally associated with a considerably later period of industrial history. Generally understood to have first emerged in any systematic and widely applied form in 18th century European firearms manufacturing. More than 2,000 years after the Qin armory system we are now examining appears to have already been applying broadly similar principles at genuinely enormous production scale. The armory system behind the weapons. It was in the years that followed this initial finding that Chen and her colleagues turned their attention to the broader historical and administrative context surrounding the Qin state's weapons production system. A context that, drawing on surviving historical records alongside the archaeological evidence itself, revealed an administrative apparatus of genuinely remarkable sophistication for its historical period. The historical record confirms, Chen wrote in a later and more comprehensive account of her research findings, that the Qin state operated a highly centralized and closely regulated system of state armories, in which weapons production was conducted not by independent craftsmen working according to their own individual methods and standards, as remained the general practice across most other contemporary states of the Warring States period, but under direct state administrative control, following standardized specifications and, remarkably, subject to a system of individual accountability that required each component to be marked through small inscribed characters that our team has subsequently identified on a considerable number of the recovered bronze components, with the specific identity of the workshop, the supervising official, and in some cases the individual craftsman responsible for its manufacture. This system of individual accountability, which historians of the period have sometimes referred to using a phrase that translates roughly as holding each craftsman personally responsible for the quality of his own work, served, we now believe, two distinct but closely related purposes. It provided the state with a mechanism for identifying and addressing quality problems at their specific source, since any component found defective in the field could, through its inscribed markings, be traced back to the specific workshop and specific individual responsible for its original manufacture, creating a powerful incentive for consistent quality across an enormous production system employing, based on surviving historical estimates, many thousands of individual craftsmen working across numerous state-controlled workshops. But it also, we believe, served a more directly practical manufacturing function, providing the kind of rigorous quality control and standardized specification enforcement that would have been genuinely necessary to achieve the level of dimensional consistency our own physical measurements of the recovered trigger mechanisms have actually confirmed. A fictional craftsman's world. It is against this genuine and increasingly well-documented historical background that we might imagine, as Chen herself occasionally did in the more reflective passages of her later, more popularly oriented writing on the subject, the actual daily working life of one of the many thousands of craftsmen whose individually inscribed names survive in small and easily overlooked bronze characters on the weapons excavated from the Qin Emperor's vast underground army. Let us call him Sang Yu, a bronze worker attached, according to the kind of workshop organization the historical and archaeological record actually documents for this period, to one of the numerous state armories operating under the authority of the Qin central government during the final, decisive decades of the Unification Wars, a fictional but historically grounded figure whose imagined daily experience allows us to appreciate, in more vivid and specific human terms than any purely technical archaeological analysis can fully convey, exactly what the standardization Chen's team documented would actually have required of the individual craftsmen tasked with achieving it. Sang Yu's work, we might reasonably imagine based on the surviving evidence of how these workshops actually appear to have operated, would not have resembled the traditional image of an individual artisan crafting a complete weapon from beginning to end according to his own personal judgment and technique. He would instead have been responsible for a single, specific component of the overall trigger mechanism, perhaps the release lever specifically, a component whose precise dimensions and precise fit against the mechanisms. Other components had been established through careful specification by senior workshop officials. Specifications Sang Yu would have been required to follow with a level of dimensional precision that his own individual craft judgment, however skilled, was not permitted to deviate from, even where his own experience might have suggested a slightly different approach could produce an equally functional, if differently proportioned, result. I want you to understand, Chen wrote, imagining this craftsman's likely daily working reality in a passage she eventually included in a more accessible account of her research intended for general readers, that this represented a genuinely significant departure from the traditional relationship between an ancient craftsman and his own individual skill and judgment. A bronze worker of this period, working under this kind of standardized state armory system, was not being asked simply to demonstrate his personal skill in producing a single excellent weapon. He was being asked to subordinate his own individual craft judgment to a standardized specification established by others, with his success measured not by the individual excellence of any single completed weapon in isolation, but by the consistency and interchangeability of the components he produced across an entire production run that might, over the course of a working career, have encompassed many hundreds or even thousands of individual trigger mechanisms. Each one required to conform closely enough to identical specifications that any single component could, in principle, be substituted into any other mechanism produced under the same specifications by any other craftsman working within the same standardized system. What standardization cost and what it purchased. The imagined daily reality of a craftsman like Sang Yu, working under this kind of rigorous standardized system, would very likely have involved a form of professional experience genuinely different from what most craftsmen of the ancient world, working within more traditional individual artisan production systems, would have known, a difference that Chen, in her later, more reflective writing on the subject, found herself drawn to explore in terms that extended well beyond narrow questions of manufacturing technique. There is a real question which the surviving historical and archaeological record cannot fully answer with certainty about how craftsmen of this period actually experienced and understood this kind of standardized production work. Chen wrote, "Did a craftsman like the one we have imagined take genuine pride in the precision and consistency of his standardized output, understanding his own individual contribution as part of a larger and genuinely consequential collective achievement, the equipping of an army whose eventual success in unifying China for the first time in that civilization's history depended, in some genuine if difficult to precisely measure degree, on exactly the kind of reliable, field-repairable weaponry that his own careful, disciplined work helped make possible. Or did he experience this same standardized, specification-driven work as a genuine diminishment of his own individual craft identity, a loss of the kind of personal creative latitude that a more traditional individual artisan production system would have permitted him, in exchange for a system that valued his output primarily for its conformity to specification, rather than for any individual distinctiveness or personal artistic expression? I do not believe the surviving evidence allows us to answer this question with any real confidence, and I would caution against assuming too readily that either interpretation is straightforwardly correct. What I believe we can say with confidence, based on the physical evidence our own careful measurement and analysis has actually documented, is that this standardized system achieved something genuinely remarkable in purely practical military terms. Equipping the enormous conscript armies that Qin Shi Huang eventually deployed to conquer and unify the whole of China with weapons reliable and consistent enough that a soldier whose own crossbow trigger mechanism failed or was damaged during actual combat could, at least in principle, receive a replacement component drawn from general army supply, rather than requiring his specific individual weapon to be returned to its original craftsman for specialized, individually fitted repair. A logistical advantage that would have mattered enormously to the actual practical sustainability of the kind of large-scale, extended military campaigns that the final Qin unification wars genuinely required. The broader pattern of Qin military organization. It was in the years following her initial findings regarding the trigger mechanisms specifically that Chen's research expanded to encompass the broader pattern of military organization and logistics that the Qin state appears to have developed across the final decades of the Warring States period, a pattern that, taken as a whole, she came to argue represented one of the more genuinely underappreciated dimensions of how Qin ultimately succeeded in conquering and unifying the numerous rival states that had, for centuries prior, remained locked in the sustained, mutually destructive warfare that gives the entire historical period its name. The traditional popular narrative of the Qin unification, Chen wrote in a later and more broadly synthetic account of her research, tends to emphasize factors such as Qin's adoption of legalist political philosophy, its ruthlessly effective system of centralized administrative control, and the particular military and strategic genius of specific Qin generals and administrators whose individual names and individual achievements the surviving historical record has preserved in considerable detail. I do not wish to diminish the genuine significance of any of these traditionally emphasized factors, which the historical record clearly supports as having mattered considerably to Qin's eventual success. But I would argue, based on the archaeological evidence our own excavation has been able to document, that this traditional narrative has significantly underappreciated a further, less visible, but genuinely consequential factor. The specific and for its historical period, genuinely remarkable sophistication of the Qin state's approach to standardized weapons production and military logistics, which allowed Qin armies to sustain effective combat capability across military campaigns of a scale, duration, and geographic extent that armies equipped through more traditional, less standardized production systems would very likely have found considerably more difficult to sustain. This is not, I want to emphasize, a claim that standardized weapons production alone explains Qin's eventual military success, which depended on a great many additional factors that lie well beyond the scope of my own specific archaeological specialization. It is rather a claim that this particular dimension of Qin military organization, the disciplined, centrally administered, and genuinely precise standardization of weapons manufacturing that our own careful measurement of the recovered trigger mechanisms has directly documented, represents a genuine and significant contributing factor that the traditional historical narrative, focused as it has generally been on political philosophy and individual strategic genius, has not previously received the specific scholarly attention that the archaeological evidence, once properly examined, genuinely appears to warrant. What Sun Tzu might have recognized. It was in the course of this broader research that Chen found herself, somewhat to her own initial surprise, as a specialist in bronze metallurgy rather than in classical military philosophy, drawn into a closer engagement with the strategic writing tradition that had emerged from roughly this same general historical period. The tradition associated most famously with the treatise attributed to Sun Tzu, that had shaped Chinese strategic and military thought for centuries both before and after the specific Qin unification campaigns her own archaeological work primarily concerned. I was struck reading this strategic tradition more closely in the course of my own broader research, Chen wrote, by how directly certain of its central principles appear to anticipate, at a conceptual level articulated centuries before the specific archaeological evidence I have spent my own career documenting, exactly the kind of logistical and organizational sophistication that our excavation has revealed in physical material form. The text attributed to Sun Tzu places very considerable emphasis, across several of its most extensively developed passages, on the fundamental importance of reliable logistics and sustained supply to any successful military campaign. The recognition that an army's actual combat effectiveness depends not merely on the tactical skill of its commanders or the individual courage of its soldiers, but on the mundane, unglamorous, but genuinely essential question of whether that army can be reliably supplied, equipped, and maintained across the actual physical duration and geographic extent of a real military campaign, conducted, as real campaigns invariably are, under conditions of genuine uncertainty, genuine attrition, and genuine logistical strain. I do not believe it is mere coincidence that the same broader historical period, and the same broader Chinese strategic culture that produced this text's sophisticated theoretical emphasis on logistics and sustained supply also produced, in the specific case of the Qin state, an actual practical manufacturing and administrative system precise and disciplined enough to genuinely achieve the kind of reliable, sustainable military supply that the theoretical tradition had identified. In the abstract, as so fundamentally important to ultimate military success. The standardized crossbow trigger mechanisms our excavation has recovered are not, in this sense, merely an interesting technical curiosity in their own right. They represent, I would argue, physical and material evidence of exactly the kind of disciplined, patient, unglamorous strategic thinking that the broader Chinese military tradition of this period, in its more purely theoretical and philosophical expression, had already identified as the true and often underappreciated foundation of sustained military success. The recognition that victories are decided in very considerable part, not merely by the dramatic clash of armies on any single battlefield, but by the patient, careful, and often genuinely tedious work of ensuring that an army's weapons, when they eventually reach that battlefield, will actually function reliably and can be reliably repaired and resupplied across whatever extended duration the actual campaign ultimately requires. What the excavation continued to reveal. The years that followed Chen's initial findings brought a steady stream of further archaeological evidence, as the ongoing excavation of the vast terracotta army complex continued to yield additional weapons and additional insight into the broader Qin state production system that had originally equipped it, evidence that, taken together, painted an increasingly detailed picture of a manufacturing and logistical apparatus considerably more sophisticated than most historians studying the period. Prior to this excavation's findings had previously appreciated. We have now documented, Chen wrote, in a later summary of the excavation's cumulative findings regarding weapons production specifically. Standardized components not merely in the crossbow trigger mechanisms that first drew our particular attention, but across a considerably broader range of the weapons recovered from this site, bronze arrowheads manufactured to remarkably consistent dimensional specifications across enormous production quantities. Sword and dagger axe components showing similarly disciplined standardization, and perhaps most strikingly, a system of standardized measurement and quality control evident in the consistent metallurgical composition of bronze alloys used across weapons, recovered from workshops that our inscription evidence confirms were operating in entirely different regions of the Qin state, separated by considerable geographic distance, and yet producing components to a degree of consistent specification that strongly suggests centrally atom. Administered standards communicated and enforced across an extended administrative apparatus, rather than merely the accumulated informal convention of individual craft traditions developing independently in different regional workshops. This is, I want to emphasize, a genuinely remarkable achievement for any manufacturing system operating without the kind of precision measuring instruments, standardized units of measurement enforced through modern metrological institutions, or mechanized production processes that later industrial manufacturing traditions would eventually develop to achieve broadly comparable levels of component standardization. The Qin state achieved this level of manufacturing consistency through what appears to have been a combination of carefully developed and centrally distributed physical templates and gauges, rigorous administrative oversight and individual accountability enforced through the inscribed identification system our team has extensively documented, and we must assume a very considerable investment in the training and disciplining of individual craftsmen across an enormous production workforce. To achieve consistent adherence to centrally established specifications across a manufacturing system operating at a genuinely enormous scale, sufficient to equip the many hundreds of thousands of soldiers that historical records suggest the Qin state ultimately mobilized across the full span of its unification campaigns. A reflection on what history chooses to remember. It was in the final years of her own long research career, once the broader significance of her excavation's findings regarding standardized weapons production had become reasonably well established within the specialized scholarly literature on the period, that Chen found herself increasingly drawn to a broader reflection on why this particular dimension of Qin military history had remained so thoroughly underappreciated prior to her own team's archaeological work. A reflection she eventually set down in the introduction to what would become her own most widely read and most broadly accessible account of the excavation's significance. I have thought a great deal across these many years of research about why the specific achievement our excavation has documented, a manufacturing and logistical system genuinely sophisticated enough to anticipate, by more than 2,000 years, organizational principles that most historians of technology had previously associated exclusively with much later periods of industrial history. Received so little specific scholarly attention prior to the accidental discovery that first brought this vast buried army to modern light. I believe the answer lies in considerable part in the simple fact that this particular achievement, however genuinely remarkable, produced no dramatic individual narrative of the kind that traditional military history has generally found most compelling and most memorable. We remember from this period of Chinese history the names of great generals and great strategists, the dramatic accounts of decisive individual battles, the philosophical and political innovations of the legalist administrators who reshaped Qin governance. We do not, by and large, remember the names of the many thousands of individual craftsmen whose patient, disciplined, and collectively coordinated labor actually equipped the armies that those celebrated generals commanded, even though, as our own careful archaeological analysis has increasingly persuaded me, this patient and largely anonymous collective labor mattered every bit as much to Qin's ultimate military success as any single dramatic battlefield decision or any single celebrated act of individual strategic genius. This is, I have come to believe, a genuinely important and genuinely underappreciated pattern that extends well beyond the specific historical period my own research happens to concern. The history that survives most vividly in popular memory, across almost every civilization and almost every historical period I am aware of, tends overwhelmingly to be the history of dramatic individual moments and dramatic individual actors, decisive battles, celebrated commanders, singular acts of courage or cunning that lend themselves naturally to compelling individual narrative. The patient collective, often genuinely tedious labor that actually makes those dramatic individual moments materially possible. The standardized weapons that allow a besieging army to sustain a prolonged campaign. The careful logistics that keep soldiers fed and equipped across months or years of continuous fighting. The disciplined manufacturing systems that ensure a damaged weapon can be repaired rather than simply discarded in the middle of an active campaign, tends, by its very nature, to resist the kind of dramatic individual narrative that popular historical memory most naturally gravitates toward and consequently tends to be forgotten, or at minimum significantly underappreciated relative to its actual historical significance, until some specific and often genuinely accidental piece of physical evidence, like the buried army our excavation happened to uncover, eventually forces a fuller reckoning with exactly how much of any genuinely consequential historical outcome actually depended on precisely this kind of patient, collective, and largely anonymous labor. Epilogue: what the bronze still shows. Chen Meiling continued her research into the Qin excavation's weapons production evidence for the remainder of her long academic career, eventually training a further generation of archaeologists and historians of ancient Chinese metallurgy who continued extending and refining her original findings well beyond her own eventual retirement, work that, by the early decades of the following century, had become sufficiently well established within the broader scholarly understanding of ancient Chinese military history that later general historical accounts of the Qin unification, of a kind that a general reader might encounter in any reasonably comprehensive popular history of ancient China, routinely included at least some brief mention of the standardized weapons production evidence that Chen's own team had first carefully documented and interpreted. "I do not know," Chen wrote, in the final pages of the account she eventually prepared summarizing her own career's central research contribution, intended for a general readership rather than her specialized academic colleagues, whether Sang Yu, the fictional craftsman I have used throughout this account to help imagine the actual daily human experience behind the archaeological evidence our excavation recovered, ever truly existed in precisely the form I have imagined him. I chose his name and constructed his imagined daily working experience. From the general pattern of evidence our excavation has documented regarding how Qin state armories of this period actually appear to have organized their production workforce, rather than from any single specific individual historical record. But I want to be clear that the bronze trigger mechanisms our team spent so many years measuring, comparing, and analyzing were not, in fact, imaginary. They are real physical objects manufactured by real individual craftsmen whose actual names survive, in small inscribed characters easily overlooked by any visitor who does not know to look closely for them, on many of the weapons now displayed in the museum complex that has grown up around this remarkable excavation site. I would ask any reader of this account, should they ever have occasion to visit that museum and stand before the ranks of terracotta soldiers our excavation first uncovered so many decades ago, to look, if they are able, past the undeniably impressive individual faces and individual postures of the terracotta figures themselves, toward the considerably smaller and considerably less visually spectacular bronze weapons many of them were originally equipped to carry, weapons that represent. In their own quiet and easily overlooked way, an achievement I have come to believe is every bit as remarkable as the more visually striking terracotta army that has made this site so justly famous throughout the world. Those weapons were built to a standard of precision and consistency that took the rest of the world well over 2,000 years to rediscover and systematically apply at comparable scale, by many thousands of individual craftsmen whose own names most visitors will never think to look for, and whose patient, disciplined, collectively coordinated labor helped make possible one of the most consequential military and political achievements in the whole of Chinese history. The first unification of a fractured and warring civilization into the single enduring political entity that has continued to shape the entire subsequent course of world history down to the present day. A note on what actually happened. The Terracotta Army, discovered near Xi'an, China in 1974, is a real and historically significant archaeological site consisting of thousands of life-size terracotta figures depicting the armies of Qin Shi Huang, China's first unified emperor, buried to guard his tomb complex beginning in the late 3rd century BC. Archaeological analysis of the bronze weapons recovered from the site, including crossbow trigger mechanisms, arrowheads, and other components, has revealed a genuinely remarkable degree of dimensional standardization across components manufactured at different workshops, strongly suggesting that the Qin state operated a centrally administered weapons production system, employing principles of standardized specification and component interchangeability that most historians of technology had previously associated with much later periods of industrial manufacturing history, generally dated to 18th century European developments in firearms production. Surviving inscriptions on many of the recovered weapons identify the specific workshops, supervising officials, and in some cases individual craftsmen responsible for their manufacture, consistent with historical records describing a Qin state system of individual accountability for weapons quality. This standardized production system is understood by historians and archaeologists to have provided genuine logistical advantages to Qin military campaigns, including the ability to repair or replace damaged weapon components in the field using interchangeable standardized parts, a capability that would have been considerably more difficult to achieve under the individually fitted. Non-standardized weapons production methods, more typical of other contemporary states during the Warring States period. The specific character of Sang Yu and the details of his imagined daily working life are fictional, constructed for illustrative purposes from the general pattern of archaeological and historical evidence regarding Qin state armory organization. But the broader historical and archaeological findings regarding standardized weapons production described in this account are drawn from genuine, published archaeological research into the terracotta army.